we looked at this technique that archaeologists and anthropologists use to get people to buy into the evolutionary paradigm, the Darwinian evolutionary paradigm, and the ideology that evolution is nothing but the progression of genetic material, the survival of genetic material, which has nothing to do with real evolution, but it is not what real evolution is actually about. This is a technique that is often used by Darwinists as like a religion, like literally they are the followers of this theory religiously, because that's what this is. It's a religion. Make no mistake about it. Okay, just like it's no different than creationism. It's just on the opposite side of the extremity. You know, creationism postulates God created everything and made everything the way that it is, and Darwinists say no, it was all just random mutations in nature, and it has nothing. There's no intelligence that underlies it. The intervention theory, or as I call it, the interference theory, postulates that it's kind of like a mixture between the two. There was a natural evolutionary progression, but then something of intelligence hijacked it from that path and turned it into something that it was not really intended to be. And that's what this entire theory is all about. Okay, that's what I call interference theory of human origins, that we were developing naturally at some point in our ancient past, perhaps in harmony with this planet, and perhaps living on this planet in a way that was well adapted to it, and then something else came along, as all the ancient scriptures tell us happened. We were involved with some other form of intelligence that essentially took us out of that natural state of progression and molded us to their liking through genetic manipulation. Okay, through a hybridization process, and hence that's why you see a lot of these anomalous skulls that are half human and half something else that science cannot yet identify. So, just going back to the point that putting the skulls together in a progression like this is part of Darwinists' technique to try to get people to think that the theory is reasonable and it's all figured out. And we just know that it is this way because it links this in their mind, saying, well, that sounds reasonable, but when you really look closer, there's so many there's so many differences between these skulls that they are so hard pressed to explain them, that all the differences and where those came from and why there are no transitional fossils between those states. So it's just a very clever technique that they use, which looks reasonable to people glancing at it cursorily. But if they don't do any further research, of course, they just accept it on face value. To explore that a little bit further in depth, the human being really isn't well adapted to planet Earth, period. Okay, whereas primates most certainly are and can live out in the wild fairly easily. If Darwinian evolutionary theory were correct, you would expect it to produce a better design, not a more flawed one. Human beings have up to 10 times as much adipose tissue, or body fat essentially, than primates. Primates are much leaner than human beings and they don't have a mechanism in them that activates a lot of fat storage as human beings do. This would indicate that our body chemistry and metabolisms are so drastically different that there's not really much in common there at all. So we have 10 times as much fatty tissue storage as primates do. Human skin is not well adapted to direct sunlight, and I'll go beyond this and say human beings aren't well adapted to planet Earth, period. Not only to direct sunlight to the type of star that our planet orbits, but we're not suited to the entire outdoor aspects of nature. Okay, which is why we developed clothing and sheltering and domiciles, houses, etc., and other technologies to keep us sheltered from the elements, whereas many other animals do not need to do that. They can survive in the wild. They can survive out in the open. So our skin is not well adapted to direct sunlight. We burn easily, whereas primates do not. The muscles of a human being are 5 to 10 times weaker. Well, of course, if you have bones and connective tissues and ligaments and joints and cartilage, etc., that are all essentially much less dense and weaker than in a human being, the muscles are also going to be weaker because that's what's connecting to those bones. You know, musculature is going to be a reflection of what type of bones really they're going over. And, you know, of course, human beings can work their musculature and build it up as well to become somewhat stronger, but you're never going to arrive at the inherent, innate strength of a primate. Okay, so we're all weaker than primates, essentially. 5 to 10 times weaker. If Darwinian evolutionary theory were correct, you would expect it to produce a better design, not a more flawed one. The people who try to support the hypothesis of Darwinian evolution often arrange skulls like this to basically make it visually look like it's plausible that one species evolved into another. But the main thing to keep in mind here is that there has never been one single bone shared found in a transitional species or skeleton that has been unearthed from the fossil record between any of these earlier hominid creatures and a modern human being. Not one. And this is what Darwin himself, when putting forward his own theory, told people that would have to be discovered and borne out in the fossil record for the theory to hold any weight. That there would have to be transitional species with shared elements, shared bones, and not one has ever been discovered. And this would suggest that for this theory to be true, all of that change would have had to happen in practically an overnight sense, or while we find intact skeletons of some of these species, somehow we just can't locate the skeletons of these transitional species. And I understand the difficulties in the fossilization of bones and how rare fossils actually are. But if an entire species were to be formed from an earlier one, we would have found transitional species in the fossil record by now. There's very little similarity between these skulls. Okay, there's a huge jump to go from an Australopithecine skull to, for example, a Neanderthal skull or later a hominoid skull, and then there's just as big of a jump to go from something like that up to a modern human being. And you could see the ridges around the eyes, the brow ridges and the sloping forehead. There is no forehead, I'm sorry, the sloping skull that just goes right back to the cranial case, okay? And the plates of the brain casing, the skull casing. So there's these complete lack of a forehead. You see the protruding teeth, the teeth, the jaw comes out and away from the skull, so much more pronounced in the hominids than in a human being. You see that, the face is set back, well back from the teeth, and it's underneath this huge brow ridges that aren't present on a modern human being. The jaw is completely different. There's really not much of a chin on the primates, where there's a pronounced chin on a human skull. Okay, the eye sockets are different. The brain case itself is completely different, a different shape, obviously a much different size. If you really look at all the different aspects of it, there's really not many similarities. They may look visually along certain lines similar, but when you actually compare them, they're very drastically different. And that's what he's saying here in this point, that the skulls and brain are completely different. Mostly, we're talking about also size of the brain. When you compare the size of a modern human brain to the so-called ancestors of humanity, their brain was much smaller. Human beings have drastically less body hair, one of the most easily observable physical aspects when we look at these two species, and the hair patterns are reversed in human beings as they are in primates. For an example, in the human male, hair will grow on the chest, the front part of the human male. In many cases, it will grow on the back, not nearly as thick or dense as on the front of a human male, but a primate is reversed. The hair is very, very dense throughout the entire primate, particularly on their back, and then in many cases the chest is bare or largely devoid of hair. So overall, human beings have drastically less body hair, much less dense patterns of body hair, and the hair patterns are reversed in almost all the cases with a human being versus a primate. Hair and nails on a primate really don't ever grow longer and longer and longer as the being lives. This would suggest that's a completely different genetic mechanism at work in the primate than in the human being. So I think we are a hybrid of a primate and another species, hence a completely different species.